War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 90, another weekly update. All right, I wasn't going to get back to these, but there's a lot going on. So we're going to kick off with what's going on in Minnesota and Minneapolis. Now, Trump has played around a lot with the National Guard and his little law and order kick that he's on. And I disagreed with it. And the Supreme Court came down with the right decision, in my opinion, 6-3, saying that the president could not use federalized forces, National Guard or otherwise, in order to protect federal law enforcement agents doing their job, which was his justification, stating that by protecting federal forces, it was actually a federal role. That was a little too cute by half. And the Supreme Court ruled, correctly in my opinion, that that did violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Now Trump is saying he's going to invoke the Insurrection Act and use that as justification to use Title X forces, whether they are nationalized, federalized National Guard forces, or whether they're actual Title X active duty forces. So this seems like a step up, but in fact, it has a lot more justification and is probably going to pass constitutional muster. The question becomes, what is insurrection? And the federal law, so you have United States Code, then you have the Code of Federal Regulations. So under Title X of the United States Code, which is the military, the president can act under the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act falls under Title X, on lawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States makes it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States. So I think that he's got a solid shot. I think actually this is the correct interpretation. There is a coordinated effort by civilian organizations, such as they are, and elected officials to thwart the ability of the president to enforce the laws of the United States. You may not like how he's enforcing immigration law, but the fact is people under deportation orders should be deported by law, and the president is trying to do this, and he is being directly, and I quote, obstructed, and it is making it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States. I think this is legitimate. So I think if he goes for the Insurrection Act, it's actually going to pass the Supreme Court, whereas trying to use it under the guise of protection of federal agencies didn't make it under Posse Comitatus, as I think is correct. So the Insurrection Act, which is part of the United States Code 252, does not actually define insurrection in and of itself. It simply empowers the president to act when the previous definition was. So under that previous description of when the president can act is implied an actual definition of insurrection, and I think it meets it. So under 18 U.S. Code, the criminal statute, the crime is whoever incites, sets on foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States. But when insurrection is not defined, you have to go back to the Title X, which is, one more time, unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages of rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States. And so in the grand scheme, and from a legal definition that I got online for whatever that's worth, under the combination of the 18th U.S. Code and 10 U.S. Code, it roughly translates to insurrection is a concerted, violent uprising against the authority of the United States or its laws intended to overthrow, obstruct, or resist their execution. It would fall into the last part, resisting their execution. Now, also this combination of violent. So there has been some violence, although low-key. I mean, you throw something at him, that is an act of violence. That is assault. So it is concerted. It is violent, although low-key violent, and it is against the laws of the United States trying to resist or obstruct their execution. It doesn't mean you're trying to overthrow the government. That's not what an insurrection is, although that can be part of it. Combined with this, there's a number of lawmakers who did a notorious, I don't know how you want to define it, videos reminding military members that they don't have to obey illegal orders, which, one, I don't think anybody in the military knows they don't have to obey legal orders or illegal orders. That's pretty much drummed into us. We know this. The video was unquestionably a political stunt. And Trump has threatened at least one of the members, who's a retired military officer, Colonel Kelly. I think he's Air Force. No, Captain Kelly. He's Navy, but so a captain in the Navy is an 06, a colonel in the Air Force and the Army are also 06s. So he's a naval captain and an astronaut, and naturally a Democrat. And he was part of this video. And the president has threatened him with charging him for sedition. So this goes back again to the Title 10 of the United States Code under Article 94 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So one, it's not mutiny, it's sedition. So what is mutiny? A mutiny is basically the same thing as sedition, except when it's directed against a military authority. So if a 4-star general gives an order relaying what President Trump said, a subordinate officer who refuses the order of the 4-star general could be charged with mutiny. So the actual direct definition, a mutiny is directed against a military authority. It includes refusal to obey orders, violence against superiors, or collective insubordination, and focused on breakdown of command and discipline. Whereas sedition is directed against civil authority, and it's focused on overthrowing or destroying lawful government. And it can occur even if no direct military order is disobeyed. So by trying to undermine the President of the United States without saying it directly, I don't really think Kelly actually committed an act of sedition, but boy, he's close. And I could see him being charged. I could see it getting through a grand jury or whatever the military equivalent is. I don't think he'd be convicted, mostly because he was kind of a weasel. So, and here's the thing. If members of Congress believe that the president is engaged in giving illegal orders, the Congress is supposed to impeach the president. That's how this whole thing goes. They're not supposed to encourage subordinate military officers to disobey orders when they weren't even specific. One of the worst things about the video is if you can give an example of an order that is specifically illegal and say, do not obey this particular order, well, then that's a lot more legitimate. Now it's just saying, hey, don't disobey orders because they might be illegal. And the implied threat that if you obey these orders, even though we won't say which ones are illegal, we will charge you when we get power again. It's really scumbag actions on the part, in my opinion, to undermine good order and discipline of the military, but I don't think it's actually sedition. I just think it's scummy. So if they really are concerned about illegal orders, then they should define specifically the orders that are illegal and then impeach the president, because that is what you do when the president gives illegal orders as a member of Congress, which these people all are. So this idea that they're going to give a video to tell uniformed service members don't obey orders, but we won't tell you which one, I am not a fan. So that's enough on the update on military justice and sedition and mutiny, and maybe you guys are a little bit smarter on that stuff now. Moving to the global stage. Trump was bragging about his peace with Iran. That didn't last long. As predicted, it was a ceasefire. It wasn't a peace. And to brag about making peace in the Middle East when you didn't, whatever. A little early for a victory lap because Trump has moved in a carrier strike group back into the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea, depending on which way you swing, to again threaten the Revolutionary Guard of Iran because there was an uprising and they were going to, they've apparently killed thousands already in the street, but they were going to execute some more demonstrators. And Trump wants them to not hang people, especially after he bragged about beating them in a war and how they're doing what he says. Iran's making Trump look really bad. He got played. Not a surprise. I predicted it. I think anyone who's been watching the Middle East and Iran in particular predicted he would have gotten played. You don't give a ceasefire to an enemy that calls for the death of America when they're getting beat. So people in Iran felt emboldened. And this is the second time in the past 20 years that we have abandoned an uprising in Iran. It happened in 2009 when Barack Obama first came in. There was an uprising in Iran, and the Ayatollahs crushed it. And it looks like they're going to crush the second one. In the absence of more direct military aid, the IRGC is not going to give up power. It's just the way it is. And so, again, we've encouraged the civilian population to rise up, and we're abandoning them. This has happened a few times in our history, unfortunately. It happened with the Kurds. After Desert Storm, we told them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, who then gassed them and murdered tens of thousands, and we did nothing. And you can see we went about this in Libya. Hey, let's overthrow Gaddafi. Now it's completely chaotic. The slave trade is back in action. It's violent, and it's a far worse situation for everyone involved, except for maybe the direct enemies of Gaddafi in Libya itself. Syria, we encouraged Jelani's forces, which are part of ISIS, to overthrow Bashir Assad. How's that going? I'd argue negatively. So, yet again, you got to be careful when you take a stable dictatorship and you try to, throw it over. Now, going back to Gaza, which is obviously tied in with Iran, Trump is trying to put together his Board of Peace, which has a very expansive invitee list. Now, within that, there have been dozens of countries that have already agreed to be part of the Board of Peace. I shouldn't say dozens, almost 24. And they're not our traditional allies. You have Argentina, you have Jordan, Saudi Arabia, obviously the United States, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. A lot of the Muslim nations want to be a part of this, but you also have very traditional Christian nations, Bulgaria, Hungary. You got Mongolia up in there. And as someone who spent some time in Mongolia, I'm not sure what they're going to do for us. So it's an interesting mix. And you have 6 more, Egypt, Kuwait, Vietnam, Albania, Belarus, and Israel, who stated they will accept the invitation to join the Board of Peace. Now, there is also about 24, a little bit more, nations who have been invited and have said not what they are going to do. And these are got an interesting mix here. You know, China, Russia. You've got the Vatican City and the European Union et al. Canada got their invitation revoked, which I kind of found funny. And frankly, I think the Canadian government is basically going to do whatever China tells them to do. Yeah, that's right. And then the following states have declined. All of them, except for Ireland, members of NATO. France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, because they're having a spat over, yes, you guessed it, Greenland. So we have to talk about Greenland. Now, I will say that my former job in missile defense put me in the far Arctic regions in Alaska. The primary battery of missile defense interceptors at the strategic level are located in Fort Greely, Alaska. Side note, I did command the first operational crew up there in 2004. As far as I know, the mission is still going on. So I have a little bit of very outdated knowledge. The farther north you are, a lot of advantages come. And if you look at a map, and I recommend that you do, and more than a map, look at either a map where the North Pole is the center or look at an actual globe. And you'll see that Greenland is far more north than even Alaska. It's up there. It is a very strategic location. Trump's interest in it and its ability to help the defense of the United States, that's unquestioned. And we've had forces there at what's called Thule, which is an air base way in the north part of Greenland, so way up there. We have an early warning radar, which is part of our overall nuclear defense capability. It's one of our early warning radars, improved UEWR, upgraded early warning radar, I think, at Thule. And Trump, with his Golden Dome, the expanded missile defense for the United States, Greenland would be an essential component of that. Now, obviously, Greenland is a colony of Denmark, and it's one of the last colonies. I can't say one of the last colonies compared to the numbers. There's a lot of colonies still floating around out there, but that's Denmark's. Denmark has no ability to defend Greenland. Denmark has no ability to stop anyone, China, Russia, or us, from doing whatever we want to on Greenland. The fact of the matter is the United States defends Greenland now.
It is our responsibility, but we don't have the authority. Trump's play is getting the authority to match the responsibility. Now, how he's going about it, a little boisterous, and I think that drives why so many NATO partners have specifically declined to join the Board of Peace over Gaza, although I do think there are more anti-Israel reasons for those governments. Some of the most vociferous anti-Israel rhetoric is coming out of the Western European part of NATO, which the list of people who declined the Board of Peace are certainly a part of. Certainly Ireland is part of that, but all of them. The anger over Greenland is part of their declination of the Board of Peace. So why are we having a hard time with Denmark and Greenland and the United States? Why is this conflict? Well, the EU countries, which is basically NATO minus the United States, doesn't like being reminded that militarily they're pretty much neutered. And this is reality, and it's just a big, large conflict that's going on. Trump, in my opinion, rightly is reminding the Europeans that their entire defense strategy is the United States will protect us. When I went to the Senior Reserve Officer course for NATO in Germany, I'm trying to remember the name of the town. It's got a really weird name, but very cool town. Anyways, I'm sure it'll come to me later. The European Union members who are part of NATO who are there were constantly trying to discover a mechanism by which EU forces and NATO forces can deconflict and coordinate and operate effectively. How can the EU really stand up an effective military force? The problem is the EU was created as a counter to the United States. It is specifically designed to weaken the United States. It started off with the European Economic Council, the EEC. I think it's Council, European Economic something, EEC, which was designed to counter American American economic power. And then after the fall of the Cold War, when they felt as though the Soviet Union wasn't a risk, then they decided to counter American political and diplomatic power through the development of the EU. The EU is as much an antagonist to American interests as China or Russia. They see a strong America as a threat to the EU. So there is a friction that goes on between NATO and EU that's inherent. NATO has rightly been described as a solar system with revolving, where the various planets, the member states, revolve around the sun. That is the United States. There is no NATO without the United States. Any other member country of NATO could leave and it wouldn't change anything. But NATO dissolves without the United States. In the absence of our military power and our logistics capability and just our overwhelming quantity and quality, NATO ceases to be a legitimate military power, which is exactly the frustration the EU has in developing their own military capability. They've relied on the United States since 1945. They are incapable of fighting independently in the absence of the United States support. Trump is using that as leverage, and the EU is fighting back in the only means they really have, which is diplomatic and informational. Trump's being a bit of a bully, and the EU is being a bit of a bitch. And I understand kind of both sides. As an American, obviously, I kind of support Trump instinctually simply because he's the American president. The reality is on Greenland is that it is essential in the future of American security, if we are to believe the Northwest Passage and the melting ice caps, in addition to Trump's desire for a more robust missile defense. We cannot have that in the absence of full control of Greenland, and we can't invest hundreds of billions of dollars into military infrastructure designed around a total sovereignty over Greenland when Denmark currently has the ability to give to China or Russia any basing requests that they make. And there are no guarantees that the Danish government won't in the future, and make that in the near future, give Russia or China or both bases on Greenland, which would nullify our ability to defend any infrastructure we build there. So I don't like how he's going about it, but I've also reached the point where Trump does things the way Trump does, and they sometimes work out pretty well. And sometimes you just have to acknowledge when someone's smarter than you. And when it comes to negotiations, I think Trump's better than I am. I don't think he's better at me in understanding how the National Guard works legally, but that's another story. So that's the rundown of the basic news for this past week. Next week, we're going to kind of hit the reverse button, and I skipped over a war which I shouldn't have. We're going to go over the Mexican-American War unless something weird happens and I just got to talk about it. So I'll see you then, and have a great week.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.